Forget everything the mainstream media is about to tell you about what just happened in the Strait of Hormuz, because what I'm about to walk you through is not a rumor. It is not speculation from some armchair analyst sitting in a Washington think tank, and it is absolutely not the sanitized version of events that the Pentagon press office is going to feed the networks over the next 72 hours. What happened over the past 96 hours represents the single largest conventional military technology transfer between two state actors in the post-Cold War era. And by the time I finish walking you through the operational, doctrinal, and strategic implications of this transfer, you are going to understand why the people I still talk to inside the intelligence community are describing this as the moment the entire architecture of American deterrence in the Middle East quietly collapsed. 1,000 Kalibr cruise missiles. Let that number sit with you for a moment, because the implications of that number are not something the mainstream press is equipped to process. 1,000 3M-14 caliber land attack cruise missiles transferred via maritime convoy from Chinese naval logistics infrastructure to Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy receiving facilities at Bandar Abbas and Chabahar over a 96-hour operational window that American satellite reconnaissance assets either missed entirely or were instructed not to see. And I want to be very precise about what I mean when I say the United States was shocked, because that word is doing a lot of work in the headline and it deserves to be unpacked. The shock inside the Pentagon is not the shock of surprise. The shock is the shock of recognition. The recognition that the assumptions underlying every regional contingency plan, every operational war game, every CENTCOM force posture analysis going back 15 years just got invalidated in a single logistics movement. Having spent decades in arms control and weapons inspection work, having sat across the table from senior officers in multiple militaries, having read more intelligence assessments on Chinese and Russian missile proliferation than I care to count, I can tell you that the transfer of Kalibr class systems to a non-aligned state actor was considered a theoretical possibility, a worst case scenario that featured in classified planning documents as a kind of doctrinal nightmare. It was not considered a realistic near term outcome. Beijing's calculus had always been treated as fundamentally risk averse on questions of advanced cruise missile proliferation. The assumption was that China would not transfer top tier strike systems to a state that was already in active confrontation with American and Israeli forces, because the diplomatic and economic costs of doing so were judged to be prohibitive. That assumption was wrong. That assumption was catastrophically, foundationally, structurally wrong. Let me tell you what the Kalibr actually is, because the press is going to use this word as though it were interchangeable with every other cruise missile in the global inventory. And that is exactly the kind of imprecision that causes the public to misunderstand the magnitude of what just happened. The 3M-14 Kalibr is a Russian-designed land attack cruise missile with an operational range of approximately 2,500 kilometers in its export configuration, though Russian forces have demonstrated longer ranges in combat use over Syria and Ukraine. It carries a 450-kilogram conventional warhead. It flies at sea-skimming altitudes during the cruise phase. It is capable of complex terminal maneuvers designed specifically to defeat point defense systems, and its terminal guidance package combines inertial navigation, satellite correction, terrain contour matching, and electro-optical scene matching in a way that produces a circular error probable that I am not going to state on the record, but which is significantly better than anything in the current Iranian inventory. For those of you who did not spend years in targeting and strike analysis, let me translate what those capabilities mean when you put them in the hands of a state actor that already operates one of the most sophisticated indigenous ballistic missile programs outside the recognized nuclear powers. It means that Iran no longer has to depend on saturation tactics to defeat Israeli air defense. It means that Iran no longer has to choose between precision and range. It means that every Israeli Air Force base, every command and control node, every fuel storage facility, every munitions depot, every radar installation, every Iron Dome battery position, every Arrow interceptor site, every David sling launcher, and every piece of critical infrastructure that the Israeli military has spent decades hardening against ballistic threat is now reachable from Iranian territory with a precision strike system that was specifically designed by Russian engineers to defeat the exact category of air defense architecture that Israel operates. And I want you to sit with that for a moment because the people who designed the Kalibr did so with a very particular adversary in mind. The Kalibr was developed during a period when Russian doctrine was actively wrestling with the problem of how to defeat layered Western air defense networks operating advanced ASA radar systems and networked interceptor architectures. Every design decision in the Kalibr program, the low altitude flight profile, the terminal evasive maneuvers, the multi-mode guidance package, the warhead configuration, every single one of those choices was made by engineers whose explicit mission was to penetrate exactly the kind of air defense system that Israel deploys. The Kalibr was not designed against generic threats. It was designed against the doctrinal cousin of the Israeli air defense architecture, and 1,000 of them just arrived in Iran. Now, here is where the analysis gets critical, and I want you to stay with me because this is the part that the cable news commentators are going to miss entirely. 1,000 calibers is not a deterrent inventory. 1,000 calibers is not a symbolic gesture. 1,000 calibers is an operational saturation package. The mathematics of cruise missile defense are unforgiving, and they are unforgiving in a very specific way. Every defensive interceptor in the Israeli inventory has a finite kill probability against a maneuvering low altitude cruise missile target. Every battery has a finite magazine depth. Every radar has a finite track capacity against simultaneous low signature contacts. And every command and control system has a finite ability to allocate interceptors against incoming threats in the window of time available between detection and impact. The Israeli air defense architecture was designed against a specific threat envelope. It was designed against ballistic missile trajectories, where the incoming threat is detectable at long range, where the trajectory is predictable, where the terminal phase allows for multiple interceptor engagements, and where the magazine economics favor the defender as long as the salvo size remains within calculated parameters. The Kalibr breaks every one of those design assumptions simultaneously. It flies below the radar horizon for most of its trajectory. It does not follow a predictable arc. It maneuvers in the terminal phase in ways that complicate fire control solutions. And when you launch it in coordinated salvos timed and routed to arrive at multiple targets simultaneously from multiple azimuths, you produce a defensive engagement problem that no air defense system currently in service anywhere in the world has been demonstrated to solve. But if you thought the technical specifications were alarming, stay with me because the planning behind this transfer reveals something that should be far more alarming to anyone analyzing the strategic picture. This transfer did not happen overnight. The maritime logistics operation that moved 1,000 cruise missiles from Chinese inventory to Iranian receiving infrastructure required months of preparatory work. It required the establishment of transfer protocols, the coordination of naval escort assets, the preparation of receiving infrastructure on the Iranian side, the training of Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy personnel on the operational employment of the system, and the integration of the Kalibr into existing Iranian command and control architecture. None of that happens in a weekend. None of that happens without months of bilateral coordination at the highest levels of both governments. And none of that happens without the explicit knowledge and approval of decision makers in Beijing, whose calculus on this question was previously assessed by Western intelligence services as fundamentally opposed to exactly this kind of transfer. What changed in Beijing's calculus is the question that the people I still talk to inside the analytical community are wrestling with right now, and the answers they are reaching are not comforting. The assessment that is emerging in classified circles, and I am being careful about how I describe this because there is information here that I am not going to share publicly, is that Beijing concluded over the past several months that the American security umbrella in the Middle East had been degraded to a point where the costs of arming Iran with top-tier conventional strike capability no longer outweighed the strategic benefits of doing so. That is a profound shift. That is the kind of shift that does not happen because of any single event. That happens because the accumulated weight of multiple American strategic failures, the visible strain on American magazine depth from sustained operations in multiple theaters, the political fragmentation visible to every foreign intelligence service that monitors Washington, and the demonstrated reluctance of the current administration to commit decisive force in defense of regional partners has crossed a threshold in the Chinese strategic calculus. And here is what that means in practical terms. The transfer of 1,000 calibers to Iran is not just a weapons proliferation event, it is a signal. It is Beijing telling Washington that the rules have changed. It is Beijing testing the proposition that the United States will not respond to top tier proliferation events with the kind of decisive action that would have been considered a near certainty a decade ago. And the early indications from inside the Pentagon, from the cautious language coming out of the State Department, from the conspicuous silence on Capitol Hill, suggest that Beijing read the situation correctly. There is no decisive American response in preparation. There is no naval interdiction operation. There is no coordinated diplomatic campaign to impose costs on the transfer. There is shock and there is recognition, and there is the slow institutional process of trying to figure out what the new strategic baseline actually looks like. Now, I want to walk you through what this means for Israel because this is where the strategic abstraction becomes operational reality. Every Israeli Air Force base, and I mean every single one from Hatzerim in the south to Ramat David in the north, sits within the engagement envelope of Iranian launched Kalibr cruise missiles. Tel Naf, Hatzor, Nevatim, Palmashim, Avda, every base that hosts F-15, F-16, or F-35 squadrons, every base that hosts strategic intelligence gathering platforms, every base that hosts the airborne refueling assets that give the Israeli Air Force its strategic reach. All of them are now sitting under the threat of precision strike from a weapon system that was specifically engineered to defeat the air defense architecture protecting them. And here's the part that the headline writers got right, but that the body of their reporting is not going to do justice. If Iran chose to execute a fully coordinated saturation strike against Israeli Air Force basing infrastructure using even a fraction of the 1,000 calibers now in its inventory, the kinetic effects would be catastrophic. Hardened aircraft shelters are not designed to defeat a 450-kilogram warhead delivered with the precision that the Kalibr is capable of. Runway repair capacity is finite, and a coordinated strike against runway surfaces at multiple bases simultaneously would exceed Israeli engineering throughput for days or weeks. Fuel storage facilities at military installations are inherently vulnerable to precision strike. Munitions depots, once breached, produce secondary detonations that compound the damage of the original strike package, and the loss of even a substantial fraction of the Israeli Air Force ground infrastructure for any meaningful period of time would represent a strategic catastrophe of a magnitude that the Israeli defense establishment has spent 75 years trying to make sure could never happen. I want you to understand what I am describing here because the headline is using the phrase every IDF base leveled. And I want to be careful about the distinction between what is operationally possible and what would actually happen in a real strike scenario. The point is not that every base would be physically destroyed. The point is that every base now sits within an engagement envelope where the defensive calculus no longer favors the defender. The point is that the threshold of credibility for Iranian strike capability has been moved to a place where the Israeli defense establishment has to assume, in every operational plan, that any Israeli base could be subject to precision strike that defeats current defensive capability. That assumption changes everything about how the Israeli Air Force can be employed, where its assets can be based, how its operations can be sustained, and what kind of strategic options remain available to Israeli leadership in the event of escalation. And the cascade effects extend far beyond the bases themselves. You think you have heard the worst of it? You have not. Because the introduction of 1,000 calibers into the Iranian inventory does not just threaten Israeli infrastructure. It transforms the entire regional security architecture in ways that are still being processed in capitals across the Gulf. Every American military installation in the region now sits within the same engagement envelope. Al Udeid in Qatar, Al Dhafra in the Emirates, Camp Arifjan in Kuwait, the naval facility at Bahrain, every forward deployed asset that the United States military depends on to project power across the CENTCOM area of responsibility is now in range of a precision strike system that the host country air defense networks were not specifically designed to defeat. The implications for American force posture are staggering. The carrier strike groups that have been operating in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Arabian Sea are now operating in a threat environment that requires fundamentally different defensive calculations. The forward bases that have been the backbone of American operations in the region for 30 years are now operating under a threat profile that did not exist a week ago, and the diplomatic relationships with Gulf states that have been quietly hedging their bets between Washington and Beijing for the past several years are now subject to a new calculation in which the credibility of American protection has been visibly degraded by Beijing's willingness to arm Iran with capabilities that Washington could not prevent from being delivered. The question that is being asked behind closed doors right now, and I want to be very careful about how I frame this because the answer matters enormously, is whether the transfer of 1,000 Kalibrs represents a one-time event driven by specific calculations about the current regional crisis, or whether it represents the opening move in a sustained Chinese campaign to systematically degrade American strategic position across the entire Indo-Pacific and Middle East theater. The early indicators, and I want to emphasize that these are indicators rather than conclusions, suggest that this is not a one-time event. The transfer infrastructure that was built to move 1,000 calibers can move 10,000. The bilateral coordination mechanisms that were established to support this transfer can be applied to other weapons categories. The political calculus in Beijing that produced this decision can produce similar decisions about other systems in other theaters. The Kalibr transfer is not the conclusion of a process, it is the beginning of one. Having been there myself, having sat in rooms where the implications of strategic proliferation events get assessed by people whose job it is to think about these questions seriously, I can tell you what this moment actually looks like from inside the analytical community. It looks like the moment when the assumptions that have organized American strategic thinking for a generation are being visibly invalidated by events on the ground. The assumption that great power competitors would be cautious about top-tier proliferation. The assumption that economic interdependence would constrain strategic behavior. The assumption that American deterrence would hold against the specific scenario of advanced cruise missile transfer to a state actor in active confrontation with American allies. Every one of those assumptions just got tested and every one of them just failed. The decisions that will be made in Washington and Jerusalem, in capitals across the Gulf, and in Beijing over the next several weeks will define the next phase of this strategic competition in ways that the decisions of every previous month have not. The calibers are in Iran. The transfer cannot be undone. The capabilities cannot be unlearned. The threshold cannot be uncrossed. And the people whose job it is to think about what comes next are operating under a level of strategic pressure that I can tell you from direct experience produces decisions that often have consequences extending decades into the future. At what point does a strategic competition that has been managed through proxies and signaling stop being a competition and start being something fundamentally different? At what point does the visible degradation of American deterrent credibility produce the kind of cascading recalculation by regional actors that transforms the architecture of an entire theater? At what point does the cumulative weight of strategic failures arriving in sequence force a reckoning that the political system in Washington has spent years avoiding? Those are the questions that are being asked behind closed doors right now. Those are the questions whose answers will not be available in any press briefing, in any congressional testimony, in any mainstream commentary that the next several news cycles will produce. The Kalibrs are in Iran, the architecture has been rewritten, and the smoke from this transfer, invisible in the satellite imagery, visible only to those of us who understand what just happened, is still rising over a strategic landscape that no longer looks anything like the one we woke up to a week ago.